Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight. This is the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the Void, about books, movies, music that I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today I would like to talk about musicians who have flawed personalities but who make beautiful music. At least that's the title of this video, but actually what I was thinking about was more people who, when you get to know more about their personality, it seems to contrast with their music in a way that's kind of difficult to understand. And it interests me most when the music maybe is more beautiful or sensitive or moving, and you find out that the person's way of living was very different to their artistic expression. So, for example, like people who I wouldn't be talking about are maybe like Fiona Apple, who is seems to be like quite an erratic person, at least in her public persona, and has lived a life where she seems to have been quite troubled, at least when she was younger, and she's kind of been in and out of the spotlight as a result and released music sporadically. But that's actually really in keeping with the way her music kind of sounds and the types of things that she writes about in her music. Another person is Courtney Love, who many people consider to be quite a flawed person. I have a lot of affection for Courtney Love, but she's certainly made a lot of enemies and she's been quite outrageous throughout her career. But that's also completely coherent with the way that Hole sounds, especially the early music by Hole. Another person who I wouldn't say fits this bill is Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins, who seems to be quite a kind of pompous and difficult personality, but also makes music that's kind of very pompous and complex and a little tasteless. Although I like the Smashing Pumpkins a great deal, you can see how Billy Corgan's personality, which is this combination of kind of arrogance and sensitivity, is very much expressed in the musical style of the band. What I'm talking about more is people whose style of music really seems out of kilter with their way of living. And the first person that I thought about when I was thinking about this was the folk singer John Martyn, because John Martyn's music, at least the music that he's most famous for, like his album Solid Air, is very melodic, very sensitive, very beautiful, quite brooding. And I saw a documentary about him when I was in my early 20s, when I liked his music a great deal. And he was like this boorish, aggressive, loud, and quite potentially violent type of guy. And I thought at the time that it was so strange that he was able to find this kind of vulnerable sensitivity in his music, and that maybe for a Scottish guy of his generation and his background, maybe music was the only place he could find an expression for this. And another person who maybe fits this bill is Leadbelly, otherwise known as Huddy Ledbetter, who was a blues musician in the American South in the 30s and the 40s. He was recorded by Alan Lomax, among others. He was born in Louisiana in the 1880s, reputedly to one black parent and one parent of Native American origin. Now, the blues is known to be like quite a sort of earthy, dark, and at the time was considered like quite frightening by many type of music. And so you have like Robert Johnson, who wrote a lot of music about the devil and about violence, and who lived a pretty rough life. So maybe you wouldn't think it's surprising that Leadbelly also lived a quite violent and volatile life. But Leadbelly's music has like a real warmth to it, and he has this kind of lonely, beautiful voice, and some of it's also quite joyous and happy, but none of it is like threatening or violent or volatile. It's quite charming, and yet he was jailed several times throughout his career for attempted murder. So he was a man who was quite prone to serious acts of violence. Now, you have to take into account that in America at the time, it was probably a lot easier to get arrested and jailed as a black man than as a white musician. But still, a lot of the old blues guys did not end up in jail, and certainly not repeatedly. So Leadbelly's somebody that I think about in this category, where you don't necessarily hear that side of his personality in his music. Rather, you hear something much more kind of likable, warm, melancholy, beautiful. Another person whose personality I find kind of is in contrast to their music is the electronic musician Moby. Now, some things about Moby kind of do make sense with his music. Like he seems to be like quite a nerdy guy who's like goes very deep into his interests, and a lot of his music like draws on different styles, and he uses archival recordings and stuff. He's also a very political person. He's a vegan. I think he's a pacifist, and he's an animal rights activist. It was hard for me to explain exactly what it is about Moby's music that I feel like is in contrast to his character. But so this album, for example, now this is one of Moby's later albums. It's not as well known. It's called All Visible Objects. This was an album that I listened to a lot during COVID lockdown, and the whole second side of it, or the whole like second part of it, is all these beautiful ambient pieces with piano. Moby's a pretty good pianist, and the first part's more electronic, but it's all very beautiful. But then I read both of Moby's autobiographical books. Now the first one is quite interesting. It's kind of about him struggling and almost giving up electronic music because his career never quite took off, and by the time he was making his most famous album, Play, he was basically poor and very disillusioned, and he wasn't expecting that album to be successful. He made it for basically no money at home, so that's really interesting. But then he released this second part of his autobiographical writings, was a book about after he became famous. And in this book he goes back and forth between his childhood, which was quite traumatic, and his adulthood, his professional career. And his stories of his professional career are just story after story after story after story of being a very annoying, self-involved alcoholic who is continually seeking the approval of women. It's written as if he's giving a self-critique, and like all of these things, by the end of it, he has like a rock bottom moment and he gets sober. But the way in which he kind of names and goes through all of these different women who he nearly dated, or who he tried to make out with, or he was in a relationship with, or like even he talks about knowing Lana Del Rey before she became famous. And it's like, honestly, he's such a starfucker. Like Moby is the biggest starfucker, and he's kind of, in a way, like humble bragging the whole time. Like, oh, I was so crazy. I got so wasted. I tried to make out with this woman. It's like, Moby, this is so boring. The book was so dull. And I was like, you come across as this kind of sensitive, intelligent, caring person, but your book is like, listen, it's like that. Have you ever seen that video of Fiona Apple listening to Quentin Tarantino talking? That's what it feels like reading Moby's autobiography. And I still love his music, but when I listen to it, I sometimes think, how does this guy who's so flawed create music that's so beautiful? So another person in this category, a flawed individual who makes very beautiful music, is Charles Mingus. Now, Charles Mingus, I enjoy his music a lot. He was a bass player. He made jazz music, but he originally wanted to be a classical composer. Now, like Nina Simone, he knew a lot about classical music, and he wanted to write symphonies and he wanted to write for orchestras. But at the time when he was creating music, the same way as Nina Simone, this was not a possibility for a black American. So the jazz ensemble, if you like, that was Mingus's orchestra, and he composed very varied and beautiful music for jazz bands. He also played the piano really well. He had an album I think it's called Mingus Plays Piano, which came out in the mid-60s. The first track on it is a piece that I think is called Myself When I Am Real. And it's just incredible. I think that's one of my favourite albums of piano music. He calls it like an album of spontaneous compositions and improvisation. So he's just sitting down in the studio playing piano, and it's just, this is what I'm saying, because you get the sense, okay, this guy's just pouring his soul out through the piano. But then I read this book, Charles Mingus Beneath the Underdog, and he comes across as just as educated about music and just as smart a guy as you would think. But then a vast amount of this book is just basically about being a pimp and, you know, treating women extremely badly and like try and just, yeah, pimping. Now, it has to be said that this autobiography was originally something like 600 pages long, or maybe it was like 900 pages. I remember it was the manuscript was extremely long, and an editor cut it down to like 230, 250, yeah, 250 something. And that editor chose to include all the stuff about pimping and get rid of loads of other material. And that was because, what's the guy's name? Iceberg Slim, his book, Pimp, was a really big seller at the time. So they were trying to cash in on it. But I'm like, this is a book about a jazz upright bass player. Why are you going to try and cash in on Iceberg Slim's story of being a pimp? It's crazy. Still, the pimping stuff, he did write it. And not only that, but he was known to be very explosive, very violent. He famously was working on a score with Jimmy Knepper, who was a trombone player, and they got into an argument, and Mingus knocked out his front teeth. So, which, if you know anything about playing a brass instrument, losing your front teeth is a complete disaster. To me, it kind of makes Mingus's music all the more incredible that he was such a troubled, violent, probably traumatized guy, and yet he was making such enjoyable, exciting and beautiful music. Now, another person whose autobiography I read and whose account of themselves really kind of struck me as in kind of real tension with how I experienced their music is the singer Mark Lanegan. Mark Lanegan was originally in the Screaming Trees, a Seattle band, but I really love his solo music, which is a kind of combination of like blues, drawing on old blues, and like rock music. And then later on, he draws on some electronic elements as well. But it's mostly, a lot of his music is based around this beautiful, soulful voice that he has. This is a bit like what I was saying about John Martyn. So much of this book is about fighting or being threatening. And he is this guy who was kind of bullied and messed with and abused his whole childhood. And he never kind of got over it. And he was looking for a fight in basically any situation that he got into later on. He also had a massive alcohol problem, and then he became addicted to heroin. Now, the section in the book where he's most addicted to drugs, like he knows Lane Staley from Alice in Chains. He was friends with Kurt Cobain. He's friends with the guy from Earth. But he's selling at first, and he has a woman working for him who kind of is his servant, basically. It's kind of disgusting. And then ultimately, he ends up being in this situation for somebody else. So it's kind of a story of decline. And it's obviously influenced by Burroughs, and he's kind of trying to show you how awful being a heroin addict is. There's aspects of it that's a little bit like the Moby book, like it becomes very repetitive. But there's just a sort of swaggering, macho aspect to the whole thing that I don't really feel like you hear in a lot of his music. And it's not as if it put me off, but it just kind of struck me, you know, I kind of hear something maybe in some of these men's music that is more feminine, more emotional, more sensitive, in a way that they really don't describe themselves when you read them in their own account. So talking about drugs, and also with Mingus talking about jazz, like the one that for me was so bad that it almost made me not enjoy the music anymore, is Chet Baker. Now, Chet Baker was one of my favorite musicians. A lot of people find he's okay. So if you don't know him, white guy, played the jazz trumpet at the same kind of time when people like Miles Davis were getting big, and not necessarily always very well thought of, because he kind of played a very sort of soft, cool style of jazz and stuck with it, when a lot of other people in the African American community were more experimental. And he was seen as a bit of a pretender. He made very beautiful, sweet sounding music, and he has this album, Chet Baker and Strings, which was supposed to be quite influential on South American jazz. I think it's really, really beautiful. He also used to sing, and he kind of crooned Anyway, I read a biography of Chet Baker, and this guy was a completely shallow individual who, through most of his career, was only interested in getting drugs. And he burnt basically everyone he knew trying to get drugs. He beat all of the women that he was ever in a relationship with. But there's one story in that book where he bought a dog. I think he was on tour and he got bored of the dog, so he just left the dog in the street. And that story, I don't know why, but that story just, when I listen to his music, I'm like, Chet Baker, you're a liar. This music is lies. Like the rest of the people that I've mentioned, I just feel like it's really interesting that that aspects of their aesthetics or their soul come out in their music that you don't necessarily see reflected in their biography or the description of themselves. But with Chet Baker, I was like, reading about him, it almost made me feel like the music is a con job. Okay, that's just some examples. I was thinking about it. There's other people as well that I won't get into now, but people who I've seen live and their behavior was like totally at odds with how I imagined them. Um, I think it's an interesting topic. In some ways, like with Lanegan and with Charles Mingus, it kind of improves the music for me. With Moby and Chet Baker, it's sort of the opposite. So I wonder if you have any examples of similar stories of learning about people's personality characteristics and being surprised in relation to the art that they create. That's it for now. Hope to see you again. Lots of love.